Hello, my name is Brian Stevenson. Sorry, just getting the camera ready. And tonight I would like to tell you about an ancient Semitic sanctification ritual that I have discovered in the Bible. Now, first of all, a word of explanation. When a historian makes a discovery, he writes it up as a paper and submits that paper to a journal. There it is read by a board of academics, and if they accept the paper as a genuine discovery, it is published in the journal in recognition of his achievement. And that is what I did do 36 years ago. However, it was only after I submitted the paper that I discovered the board only consider papers that have been submitted by someone with a university degree, an appropriate university degree. And I didn't have one, and at the time I wasn't in a position to pursue any studies. So for 36 years I have been sitting on this discovery while hoping that my children would grow up and publish it in their names. As it turns out, they both went to university, but neither are the least bit interested in ancient history. So rather than wait for my grandchildren to grow up, because I'm now 70 years old and I don't know if I'll be here when they've grown up, so I'm making this video and you can then judge the value of what I've found, whether or not you accept it as being true. So let's begin. In about 1000 BC, the Semitic tribes of Canaan were at war with the Philistines. Now, the Semitic tribes were living here. This is a very simple map, so you'll have to forgive me. And the Philistines were on the coast here, the Mediterranean coast. This is Jerusalem, the Dead Sea, and Sea of Galilee up there. And in order to resist the incursions of the Philistines, the Semitic the Semitic tribes here formed confederations, and they were the embryonic Israelite state of Israel, the kingdom of Israel. So without that pressure from the Philistines, there would have been no Bible, I suppose, and the history of the world would have been very different. The heart of the Israelite Confederation was a sanctuary. This one here, it's Shiloh, 20 miles north of Jerusalem. And in 1000 BC, the priest of Shiloh was a man named Eli. The story's in the first book of Samuel, and it's a fascinating story to read. And Eli had two sons, and they were causing him a great deal of unhappiness. I would guess the two boys were in their mid-teens or early 20s. And in chapter 2, verse 22 of the first book of Samuel, we read this verse. And Eli was very old, and heard all that his sons did to all Israel, and how they lay with the women that assembled at the door of the tent of meeting. Now, the tent of meeting is a misnomer. It probably was a tent in the very distant past, but by 1000 BC it was a substantial temple, a stone temple. I've made a drawing. I'm not very good at drawing Semitic temples, but this gives you some idea of what it looked like. It's a very simplified drawing. There would have been outbuildings and probably corridors and whatnot, but I've just concentrated on the basic building itself. This is a cutaway. So here's the Holy of Holies, where the idol or whatever it was situated. There's a curtain, and the congregation stood at this end. And here is the door around which the women were congregating. So, when I read that verse, I was 14 years old and very religious, and two things actually grabbed my attention. The first was that there were women standing around the doorway. What on earth were they doing there? Why would you stand around the doorway to a temple? And secondly, they were willing to have sex with Eli's sons. And the problem there is, if they were having sex with his sons, it's quite likely they were having sex with the pilgrims who came to Shiloh. So it didn't really look like a place of pilgrimage. At the time, my idea of a place of pilgrimage was something like Lourdes in France. But certainly something interesting was going on in Shiloh, though try as I might, I could make no sense of it. And it didn't end there. Those same women are also mentioned in the book of Exodus, which is one of the two oldest books of the Old Testament. And in this verse, it talks about Moses, but Moses, by the time this verse was written, Moses was long dead. And what this verse is actually describing is the religious paraphernalia that was present at the temple of King Solomon in Jerusalem. So it's a bit confusing if you're not familiar with the Bible. But bear with me and you'll understand. And the verse says, "And he made the basin of brass, and the foot of it of brass, of the mirrors of the huge number who gathered at the door to the tent of meeting." Once the Philistines had been defeated, the shrine was moved from Shiloh to Jerusalem, and that became the Temple of Solomon. So outside that temple stood a basin made from the hand mirrors taken from the women standing at the doorway. And it must have been a big basin because there were a lot of women there. The Hebrew word that I have translated as a huge number is actually related to the word for army, which suggests the number was very large indeed. I have here a hand mirror. This is just like the mirror the women would have carried, and it's very heavy. I'm afraid this isn't a Canaanite hand mirror, it's actually Japanese and has a fascinating history which is nothing to do with what we're talking about now. But anyway, this is what they were carrying, and it's very heavy. So more than a century has passed since Eli in Shiloh and King Solomon's temple in Jerusalem, and yet the women are still there. Their great-great-granddaughters were still there. And there must have been an explanation originally in the Bible, but unfortunately the Bible has been rewritten a great many times. You see, the Bible isn't just one book, it's made up of a great many books that were written over a very long period of time. The actual writing of the Bible began during the 8th century, but even then it was based on literature that went back hundreds of years earlier than that. Some of the things in the Bible must be approaching 3,000 years old. Parts of it are incredibly old, but that's all for another time. So as the beliefs of the Israelites evolved, because they weren't always monotheists, they began by believing in a whole host of gods. You would never think so if you read the Bible, but that's because the Bible has been edited, it's been rewritten so many times. Anything embarrassing has been removed, and one of the things that has been removed is the reason why those women were standing at the temple doorway. So the reason those women were standing outside the temple must have been so embarrassing that it had to be completely removed from the Bible, leaving us with a problem. After reading about Eli and his sons, 20 years were to pass, and then one day I was reading this book. It's written by a man named Herodotus. It's called The Histories. I'll find the title page. There, The Histories by Herodotus. And Herodotus lived at the beginning of the 5th century, and he was a traveller. And on one of his journeys, he travelled to Babylon. And let me give you a map to understand that. Herodotus was actually born up here somewhere in Halicarnassus on the eastern coast, on the western coast of Turkey. It was a Greek colony. But he travelled across Turkey, Syria and Iraq until he reached Babylon down here. Jerusalem is way over here. Okay? The other side of the Syrian desert. Now, the Israelites and Babylonians were actually very closely related. You would never think so to read the Bible, but they were. Both were Semitic, excuse me, and both spoke related languages. And that is where Herodotus comes in, because he wrote about his travels And after telling us about the history of Babylon, he goes on to describe its people. And nearing the end, he writes this passage, which I will quote, and concentrate on this because it is fascinating. The most disgraceful of the Babylonian customs is the following. Every native woman is obliged once in her life to sit in the temple of Aphrodite and have intercourse with some stranger. Many, disdaining to mix with the rest, being proud on account of their wealth, come in covered carriages and take up their place at the temple, with a numerous train of servants attending them. But the far greater number do thus. Many sit down in the temple of Aphrodite, wearing a wreath of cord about their heads. Some are continually coming in and others going out. Passages marked out in a straight line lead in every direction through the women, along which strangers pass and make their choice. When a woman has once seated herself, she must not return home until one of the strangers has thrown a piece of silver into her lap and laid with her outside the temple. He who throws the silver must say, I beseech the goddess Mylitta to favour you. For the Assyrians call Aphrodite Mylitta. The silver may be ever so small, yet she will not reject it, for it is not lawful for her to do so, as the silver is accounted sacred. The woman follows the first man that throws and refuses no one. But when she has had intercourse and has absolved herself of her obligation to the goddess, she returns home, and after that time, however great a sum you may give her, you will not gain possession of her. Those that are endowed with beauty and symmetry of shape are soon set free, but the deformed are detained a long time from inability to satisfy the law. For some wait for a space of 3 or 4 years. There we are. Now, the first thing to note is that there never was a Babylonian goddess named Mylitta. Nonetheless, we can work out who Herodotus was actually referring to. He equated Mylitta with the Greek goddess of love, Aphrodite. Aphrodite's equivalent in Babylon was the goddess Ishtar, which tells us that Herodotus was actually standing outside the temple of Ishtar, where he saw a great many women. He then tells us they were there for sex with a stranger, but he doesn't say why. Fortunately, he was a good observer and has given us the clue so we can actually work out why they were there. The ancient language of Babylon, this is going back earlier, was Akkadian, and that was very similar to Hebrew. But about 100 years before Herodotus arrived in Babylon, the language changed. When Herodotus arrived, they were speaking Aramaic, and Aramaic was actually the language that Jesus spoke. Many Christians think he spoke Hebrew, but he didn't. He actually spoke Aramaic. And if you go to a synagogue, there is one of the prayers, I believe, that is actually still spoken in Aramaic in the service. Now, Milita, or Malita, as it should be pronounced, was not a name, but an Akkadian word. So the original language of Babylon was Akkadian. It changed to Aramaic, but these strangers who were going into the temple with their pieces of silver were using an Akkadian phrase as they threw the silver. And the word Malita actually meant my donation. So whatever that formula was that they said, it ended with the word my donation, Malita. And Herodotus mistook that for the name of the goddess. He obviously didn't speak Aramaic because he doesn't really know what's going on. So he's making a guess, and he's made the wrong one. Malita is an Akkadian word. Akkadian was now extinct and had become the sacred language of heaven. So in the temple, that's what they spoke. And that wasn't the only mistake that Herodotus made. And this next one is fascinating. He describes a large number of people, women, inside and outside the temple, but then goes on to tell us they only went there once in a lifetime. Now, Babylon was a large city, one of the biggest in the world in its day, but it wasn't that big to fill up a temple each day with women who only went once in a lifetime. You would need a city the size of Tokyo. You'd need millions, and there was no way there was that number in Babylon. However, we can work out how often they were really going. So let's begin with, we've got a bit of maths here, I'm afraid. So let's begin with what Herodotus saw. He tells us the strangers were throwing pieces of silver, their malita, into the laps of the seated women. Now, if I was going to have sex with a woman I had never met before, I hope I would have the decency to hold out my hand, help her to her feet, and place my piece of silver in the palm of her hand. But that isn't what the men of Babylon were doing. They were throwing the silver into the women's laps. And they couldn't have all been rude. There would have been at least one who had the decency to help the woman to her feet. But these men didn't. They were all throwing the silver into the women's laps. Herodotus then adds the women were wearing wreaths of cord around their heads. Now, it's an odd description. He's not describing headbands. He's describing a wreath of cord. Those two clues, the silver thrown and the cord, suggest these women were in some way different, and I think they were untouchable. The men didn't help them to their feet because they were rude. They didn't do it because they were afraid to touch the women. Now, if I'm right in that suggestion, There were only 2 occasions in a Semitic woman's life when she was untouchable, and that was after menstruation each month when she'd had her period, and after childbirth. Now, this fascinating little lady comes from the British Museum. This is my photograph of her, and she was carried by a woman hoping for an easier, or at least a live birth. And this little lady has just given birth, so she is untouchable, and it's hard to see, but she has a cord around her head, and I've actually got a close-up which will give you a better idea, and you can see that cord there. It's an ugly looking thing, so it's not decorative, and it's there because she's untouchable. There is another one, this one here, I've got to thank, I think it's the Pennsylvania Museum, the Pennsylvania Museum for this photograph, so thank you. So, if I'm right, the women weren't going to the temple once in a lifetime. They were going 13 times a year. And so we can check this by working the numbers, and here's the maths. And this was tough. It took me ages to really sort out these maths. Anyway, so let's begin with Herodotus first. The populations of ancient cities are really hard to work out, and Babylon hasn't, even today, hasn't been fully excavated, so it's a real guess as to how many people were living there. However, the best guess seems to be 180,000 adults, and that's the number I'm going to work with. So half that number had to be female, so 90,000 women. Now at this point we have to take into account an important variable, which is human nature. Assuming the woman, these women have got to lie with a stranger, a man they have never known, and these are decent women, they're good. They probably looked a lot like Muslim women you see today, wearing a scarf over their head, not quite so covered up as a hijab, but at least they were wearing a head covering. They were, really decent women. And the thought of lying with a complete stranger must have been absolutely horrifying. So they would want to, I'm assuming they would want to get it over with as quickly as possible so they could get on with their life. And so the best time to do that is when you are at your most attractive, so that you're in and out in minutes. So let's say they were between the ages of 12 and 30. Now, assuming a lifespan of 70 years, that represents 29,900 women. being generous to Herodotus, I'm going to assume there were days when the temple was closed. In fact, I doubt that it ever closed, because time was money, and the Temple of Ishtar was absolutely raking it in. So I don't think it ever closed, but let's assume, let's be generous to Herodotus and assume there were days when it closed. So let's say there were just 300 days a year when the temple was open to the women. Take 18 years and times that, the age between 12 and 30, and times that by 300 days, and it gives a total of 4,500 days during which these women went to the temple. And if we divide 27,900 women by 5,400 days, it gives us a daily attendance of just 5 women. Now, Herodotus doesn't tell us how many women he saw, but he makes it quite clear that there were a heck of a lot there. And so 5 women a day means that he was wrong when he said they only went once in a lifetime. There is something else going on. He couldn't speak the language, and so he was filling in the gaps, and he's made a mistake. So let's now look at it from my suggestion that these women were untouchable because they were post-menstrual. That means we also have to change the parameters. Now, today, a young woman will begin menstruating at around the age of 11. That's not carved in stone, but it's around that age. But in Babylon, it must have been much later. Poor sanitation, poor diet, and untreated illnesses. I say untreated, I mean they probably used something, but there were no antibiotics. It was just magic or herbs. And so the condition of their bodies would have delayed the onset of their menstruation. On a personal experience, my mother grew up in rather poor conditions, and she actually began smoking before she began to menstruate. She began at the age of 16, so diet and living conditions do have a strong effect on when you begin to menstruate. So let's say the women of Babylon began at the age of 14, which is just 3 years later than today. It may well have been a lot later than that, but I will take it at 14. And then the women reached the menopause, I'm saying at 38. Today it's around 50. But again, that's also affected by living conditions and diet and whatnot. In Bangladesh, women tend to reach the menopause at the age of 43, and they have access to rudimentary health care. So since the women of Babylon didn't have anything but magic, I'm saying they reached the menopause at 38. Those 24 years represent 37,242 women. who should have gone to the temple at the end of each menstruation. However, from that figure we have to subtract a whole host of reasons for those who didn't go. Those who were pregnant, or if you're pregnant you're obviously not menstruating. If you're breastfeeding, there's a tendency not to menstruate. I think most women don't when they're breastfeeding, although some do, but anyway. Then there were those who were seriously ill and so couldn't physically get to the temple and had probably stopped menstruating anyway because they were ill. And then there were those who just could not bring themselves to go. The thought of lying with a stranger was so horrifying to them that they just couldn't do it. And there must have been a lot of women like that, especially women who had lost their fathers. Without the father to throw them out the house, I think a lot of women wouldn't have gone. And or if they did go, or if they did leave the house, they probably walked around the block and then came back in. And I spent ages trying to work out how many would actually go to the temple. And the figure that I eventually arrived at was 7%. Now, I don't know, other people would probably arrive at different figures, but I think that is a fairly conservative figure. I don't think it would have been less than 7%, I'm sure it wouldn't. But, and it was probably more. But anyway, I've taken 7%. So just 7 in every 100 women who should have gone to the temple did actually go. And that works out at 2,607 women. Now, we were generous to Herodotus and said the temple closed occasionally, but I don't think it ever closed, so I'm going to say the temple stayed open every day of the year. There was no reason why any woman should not have gone any day. So if we divide 2,607 women by 28 days, the menstrual cycle, it gives us a daily attendance figure of 93 women. And that's the answer. Herodotus was wrong. They didn't go just once in a lifetime. They were post-menstrual, they were untouchable, and they were going 13 times a year. Now, it's a stroke of luck. In 1899, the German archaeologist Robert Coldaway, I'm not terribly good at German surnames, but Coldaway sounds close. He led a team excavating Babylon, and this is the book he wrote. And in it, he describes finding the temple of Ishtar. I can't read German, so there's no point in me attempting the passage, but I have taken a close-up of the plan which he drew of the temple of Ishtar, and this is actually the building outside which Herodotus was standing. And in the centre here, in the heart of the temple, this is the courtyard where Herodotus saw the women sitting, so he probably went in with his piece of silver, which makes it rather tough that he condemned the people for being immoral when he's doing the same thing. Anyway, that square is roughly 20 metres by 20 metres, so would easily have accommodated 90 to 100 women. Now, Calderway called this area outside the temple a piazza because it was so wide compared to elsewhere in the city. And if you remember, Herodotus said that not all women go inside, some arrive in their carriages. And so this is where the women would have congregated, the wealthy. So my guess of 7% may well be an enormous underestimate. The actual figure was certainly much higher. That was the reason. So with so many women, that was the reason the women at King Solomon's temple in Jerusalem were carrying brass hand mirrors. They were trying to look as attractive as possible so as to be chosen first and thus get the ordeal over with. So the women were actually competing. It also explains why the women at Shiloh were so willing to accept Eli's sons. Better a young boy than some dirty old farmer whose hands would be everywhere. So, a 16-year-old would be very acceptable, I think. Also, my calculations for the women of Babylon were very crude. I had worked on the assumption that there were just as many women aged 30 as there were aged 70, but there couldn't have been. There were probably 4 or 5 times as many women aged 30 as there were aged 70. And so I haven't done the correct figures because I think it'd probably be beyond me. But the number of women attending the temple was probably in excess of 200 every day. Add to that figure the 200 men who are coming looking for cheap sex, and you can imagine how busy the temple of Ishtar had been. So after that, and Herodotus tells us they had sex outside the temple, away from the temple. So where did they go? Now, I can't for the life of me imagine 200 couples banging away in the side streets of Babylon. It would just be impossible. So they must have left the city, and 300 metres from the temple was the gate of Ishtar. And my guess is it was named the Gate of Ishtar because the women all left the temple and went out that gate. And that led out to the fields and orchards surrounding Babylon. Now, 500 years earlier, the Israelite prophet Isaiah had watched as couples headed into the fields and orchards of Canaan. So they're doing the same thing. And in chapter 66, verse 17, Isaiah writes, "They that sanctify themselves and purify themselves in gardens following one to the midst, eating the flesh of swine and the abomination of the mouse, together shall be consumed, says Yahweh. The women were following their man into the midst of the gardens, which we can take to mean they were orchards or wheat fields. And that, I think, was the reason Eli was so frustrated by his sons. He wasn't angry that they were having sex with the women, but with where they were doing it. Being teenagers and stupid, they were probably taking the women round the back of the temple and doing it there, which was, I mean, you can't blame them. They got sex. They're teenagers are sex mad anyway, and here are women willing to do it for nothing, and but it was driving Eli nuts. But he wanted them to go out into the fields where presumably the sex would do some good. But what good are we talking about? Why is it they have to do it in a field? I think that they believed post-menstrual women had been endowed with a power. Now this probably goes way back to the Stone Age, when it was the mother goddess and everything. But so this is a survival from way back. And this mystical power must have fertilised the ground. Now that sounds really absurd, but look at this gold pendant. It's it's from a site called Ras Sharma, which is in northern Canaan, and it was the ancient city kingdom of Ugarit, and here the face, breasts and a large pubic triangle. And these pendants are found all over Israel today, and archaeologists believe them to be images of the goddess Asherah, who was in Canaanite mythology. She was the wife of Yahweh, and archaeologists believe this is Asherah. Now Asherah was a tree goddess, and so I don't know if you can see, there are scratches there. Well, archaeologists think that is a tree. Let me show you a different one. Now this is a drawing by the British archaeologist Sir Flinders Petrie. He's a late Victorian archaeologist who did fabulous work in excavating Ur in southern Mesopotamia. Now this is a drawing he made of one he found in I think it was Tel El Ajul, which is in southern Canaan. And here's what the archaeologists think is a tree. And let me show you another one. Oh, we got three of them here. Now, these are not the faces of a goddess. Let me show, if I go back to one I showed you earlier, this one. Now, if you look at this one here, now I took this photograph in the British Museum. Again, you've got face, breasts, pubic triangle, no scratches here, no tree or plant or whatever. But look closely, and her labia are parted, and she's actually menstruating. You can see it coming out. Now, it's embarrassingly graphic, but it does actually prove my point. This was not. Let's get it back. Yeah, this was not the face of a goddess, and this isn't a tree. What it is an ear of wheat. It's crude, but you know, it's definitely not a tree, it's wheat. And where are we go? So menstruation wasn't the curse it was to become in later Judaism. It filled a woman with a power that was of enormous benefit to the community. Now, when Israel Finkelstein excavated Shiloh in the 1980s, now let me show you again that map of Shiloh. There, now here we are. Now here's Jerusalem here, and here's Shiloh 20 miles north. Now when Israel Finkelstein was excavating Shiloh, he was surprised to find there were no houses there. None. What he did find were the remains of silos, buildings for storing grain. The whole site was one big grain store. Now, over in Babylon, the temple of Ishtar was probably raking in 2 or 3 kilos of silver a month. The priest of Ishtar must have been the most wealthy in Babylon. But in Canaan, the farmers who came on pilgrimage to Shiloh wouldn't have had silver. They would have had bags of grain. Remember, in 1000 BC, the Israelites were at war with the Philistines, and Shiloh was funding the war effort by gathering in all this grain. You see, in ancient times, an army could never carry all the food it needed in order to stay in the field. Instead, they had to live off the land, which in effect meant they had to steal their food. So armies moved through the land like a plague of locusts. If you read the history of the 30 Years' War in Germany, it's these armies were ruthless, and also along the way they stole anything they could get, and they raped the women, and it was horrible. But they left nothing behind. So no doubt the Philistines were winning most, if not all, of their battles, and looting and raping as they went. But with Shiloh funding the war effort, they could never make any headway. No matter how many battles they won, there was always another Israelite army ready to face them, because the Israelites were given their food. They didn't have to go looking for it. Shiloh gave it to them. So if post-menstrual women could win a war, the lust of Eli's sons in squandering that power was actually aiding the enemy. They were betraying their people. That was why Eli was so upset. And the writer, the chap who wrote that verse, made a point by saying their offence was against the whole of Israel. Now, Herodotus didn't name the ritual. I don't even know if it had a name, though I think I know what the participants in Canaan called themselves. The following is from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 23, verse 17. Book of Deuteronomy is a very old book. It's not as old as the books of Exodus or Genesis. It was written maybe 100 years later, but it's a very old book. And in verse 17, in the King James Version, there shall be no whore among the daughters of Israel, nor a sodomite among the sons of Israel. Now, the word whore is supposed to be a translation of the Hebrew word kadeshah, but it isn't. Kadeshah actually means holy. The same is also true of the word for sodomite, a homosexual man, a gay man. Thus, the passage should actually read, there shall be no sanctified woman among the daughters of Israel, nor a sanctified man among the sons of Israel, which echoes the earlier quote from Isaiah, they that sanctify themselves and purify themselves in gardens. The men and women of Canaan, the Israelites, were going into the orchards in order to sanctify themselves. Isaiah called them the Kadeshim, the sanctified ones. So I think that is the name the people used who were taking part in this sanctification ritual. They believed it was a holy act. So why would a word that actually meant holy be translated as whore and sodomite? At some point I would love to make a video about this, but it's the fault of the priesthood, unfortunately. By 300 BC, the sanctification ritual had passed into history, and all mention of it had been purged from the Bible, which left the priests who came after that struggling to make sense of passages they no longer understood. They knew the word Kadesh meant holy, and yet these holy ones were being condemned as evil. As those learned men were fiercely homophobic misogynists, they assumed Isaiah had been the same. But it turns out Isaiah never ever condemned homosexuality or prostitution for that matter. In ancient times all men went to prostitutes, and there was just as many gay men around then as there are now. So anyway, that is the name, I think. The people who took part in the sanctification ritual used to describe themselves. They were the sanctified ones. Now, one question still remains. Why have sex with a stranger when you are presumably a married woman? I've not found any exact parallel to this. I mean, I love anthropology, but try as I might, I could not find anything remotely similar to the sanctification ritual. However, there was a very interesting ritual reported from India in the 18th century. In 1769, John MacDonald, who was a Scottish Highlander, accompanied his master, who I think was Colonel Dow. Yeah, I'm sure it was Colonel Dow. Accompanied his master to Bombay, which at the time was owned by the East India Company. And while there, he took the chance to travel around India on his days off, I should imagine. And one day he arrived at a village and saw a large stone bathing pool, rectangular they are, on the edge of which sat a naked yogi meditating as the women of the village came to bathe. Now, in MacDonald's memoirs, which are still in print, Memoirs of an 18th Century Footman, I think it's a paperback now. It's a fascinating book to read. In these memoirs, he refers to the yogi as a priest. So this is what he writes. When a young girl who has been betrothed for some years is going home to her husband, for they marry very young and go to their husband's house from their father's at 12 or 13, and on that occasion goes to take a bath with two married women behind her, she makes a grand salaam to the priest and kisses his private parts, hoping he will pray that they may have children. I assume the yogi was a devotee of Lord Shiva, as Lord Shiva's penis is still worshipped in India as an erect stone pillar, usually about that high, that shape, and it's called a lingam, polished stone. And so I'm guessing the yogi was a devotee of his, and that's why the women wanted to kiss his penis. However, the reason I quote that passage is because it implies the women believed the yogi possessed some mystical phallic power. If that was the case, then perhaps the power in the women of Canaan and Babylon resided in their vaginas. It wasn't diffused throughout the whole of their bodies. Perhaps a husband was afraid to have sex with his wife while in that state, because her vagina was already familiar with his penis, which implies it had some sort of power to think, some discretionary power. And if he had sex with his wife, then the power would pass from the vagina through his penis into him. So it sounds odd, but bear with me. And so if she went with a stranger whose unfamiliar penis would make the vagina send the power into the ground instead of into him, then that was a good reason for finding a stranger. It's a bizarre theory, and yet in ancient and medieval Europe, physicians believed a woman's womb had the power to wander around inside her body. For instance, if she was congested, if a medieval woman was congested, it was thought her womb had wandered up to her lungs and was choking her. And so one way of getting it to come back down again was to burn incense outside the woman's vagina, because wombs like the smell. It's anyway, these are weird ideas, but it's a possibility. So is that the answer? Only time will tell. And there it is, I've finished. I hope I've given you plenty to think about. And if you have any comments, then please let me know, because this ritual wasn't the only thing I had discovered. I ain't going to tell you what else I found, not yet. But there's a lot to come, and it's even more exciting than this, and I'll tell you, it's fascinating. But it depends on whether or not this video is a success. This is my email. So if you have a comment, please send it to me. Depending on how many write in, I mean, I would like to answer them all, but I'm hoping I'm so inundated with emails that I couldn't possibly answer them all. But anyway, have a go, send one in. If you like the video, if you don't believe it, or if you do believe it, or whatever, just let me know. Finally, I want to thank my dear friend and son-in-law, Josh Wellborn. He is my cameraman, sound man, and will be editing this video. And he has had to sweat over this for ages. Getting the camera to work, the camera that I'm looking at now, was took him ages, but he struggled on, and I'm really proud of him. So he's from Texas and has a fabulous Texas accent, and he does voiceovers, so I'll get him to give you his email as well. And if you're doing a video and you need a good Texas accent, then he's your man. Say hello, Josh.
Good evening.
That's it. Thank you for watching. I do hope you've enjoyed it. I hope I haven't offended anyone. I don't think I should have done. Anyway, take care.